In the unforgiving dust of the 1870s Montana Territory, a sentence was passed that was not for death, but for a slower, more cruel demise. Abigail Hayes, a woman of books and scripture, was condemned for the crime of compassion, her punishment to be cast out and forced to tend to a dying Lakota warrior, a man her town had left for carrion. They gave her to him as an insult, a final degradation for them both. But they never imagined that from the very brink of death, a leader would rise, and from the depths of her punishment, a queen would be chosen. This is the story of how a man stripped of everything rose in power to command the plains, and claimed the woman sent to watch him die as his bride. The sun over Redemption Creek was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and the bowed heads of its citizens. It was a town built on stubborn hope and quiet desperation, carved out of land that had belonged to others for centuries. Presiding over it all not as a mayor but as a king was Silas Richter. His wealth flowed from the vast herds of cattle that trampled the plains, and his power was absolute, enforced by the hard-faced men on his payroll and the weary silence of the townsfolk. Abigail Hayes was an anomaly in this harsh landscape. The daughter of the town's preacher, Reverend Michael Hayes, she possessed a quiet fire that the dust and despair of Redemption Creek had failed to extinguish. While other women concerned themselves with mending and gossip, Abigail found solace in the books her father had brought from the East, and in a radical belief taught to her in Scripture that all souls, regardless of the color of their skin, were worthy of grace. This belief was her crime. It had started subtly. She had offered a clean bandage to a Cheyenne woman who had come to trade, shared a portion of her bread with a hungry native child, and most damningly had been discovered by Richter's foreman, a bull of a man named Cobb, teaching a handful of Lakota children the English alphabet by a secluded stream. To Richter, this was not charity. It was treason. It was an acknowledgement of their humanity, a dangerous idea when he was actively pushing them off the land he coveted for his ever-expanding herds. The trial was a sham, held not in a courthouse, but in the dusty street in front of the saloon, with Richter presiding from the boardwalk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Abigail Hayes, he boomed his voice, carrying over the silent crowd. You have been found to consort with the savages, offering them aid and comfort. You have undermined the security of this town and shown a preference for the red man over your own kind. Her father stood beside her, his face ashen, his hands trembling. He had pleaded, argued, and begged, but his faith was no match for Richter's gold. This is not a crime, Abigail said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. It is a duty. The Bible teaches us to love our neighbor. Richter laughed, a harsh, grating sound. These heathens are not your neighbors. They are obstacles, and your punishment will fit your crime. You seem so fond of their company, you shall have it in abundance. His men dragged forward a crude travois upon which lay the broken body of a man. He was Lakota, clad in tattered buckskin, his chest a mass of dried blood and dirt. A gunshot wound, festering and angry, marred his side. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. This warrior was the last of a small raiding party that dared to cross my land, Richter announced. My men dealt with his friends. We leave him to you. A gift. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. This was worse than whipping, worse than shaming. It was a death sentence shrouded in public service. You will be taken to the old McLeod line shack 2 miles from town. Richter decreed, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. You will be given a week's worth of water and food, and you will tend to this dying savage. When he expires, you may try to walk back. If you survive the coyotes and the sun, your penance will be considered. He was giving her an impossible task. The man was clearly beyond saving. She would be isolated miles from anyone with a corpse, her resources dwindling until she either starved or died of thirst. It was a slow psychological torment designed to break her spirit before it took her life. Reverend Hayes fell to his knees. "Silas, please. She is my only child. I'll do anything. You'll hold your tongue," Preacher Richter snapped, "or you'll find your church has lost its benefactor." Abigail looked at the Lakota warrior. His face was etched with pain, but even unconscious, there was a fierce pride in the line of his jaw and the high arch of his cheekbones. He was not a monster. He was a man dying and alone. A wave of defiant compassion washed over her fear. "I accept the punishment," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The journey to the line shack was a parade of humiliation. Cobb and another of Richter's men loaded her meager supplies and the dying warrior onto a buckboard. They drove her out of town, the faces of her neighbors, a mixture of pity, fear, and morbid curiosity. No one stepped forward. No one spoke a word in her defense. They were all subjects in Richter's kingdom. The shack was a derelict box of weathered planks leaning against the wind on the edge of a barren plain. The door hung on one hinge. Inside, the single room was coated in dust and smelled of mice and decay. Cobb unceremoniously dumped the warrior onto the dirt floor. "Enjoy the company," he sneered, tossing a sack of cornmeal and a side of salted bacon beside him. He placed 2 heavy canteens of water by the door. "Don't expect any visitors." They left her there, the rattle of their wagon fading into the oppressive silence of the prairie. Abigail stood alone in the doorway, the vast, empty sky above and the dying man at her feet. The sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in hues of blood and fire. The punishment had begun. The first night in the shack was a descent into a waking nightmare. As darkness consumed the prairie, the world shrank to the 4 crumbling walls around her. The wind howled through the cracks, a mournful song of desolation. Every skittering sound outside was a coyote, every gust of wind a prelude to some unseen terror. But the most frightening presence was the one inside with her. The Lakota warrior lay motionless, his breaths so shallow she had to lean close just to confirm he was still alive. In the moonlight filtering through the broken roof, his features were stark and foreign. He was the other, the savage the townspeople feared, the embodiment of the wild world that lay beyond the fragile safety of Redemption Creek. And she was trapped with him. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. What if he woke? What if in a moment of delirium his warrior instincts took over? Her father's words echoed in her mind, sermons about forgiveness and mercy, but they felt like hollow platitudes in the face of this raw physical reality. By the second day, her fear had been tempered by a pragmatic resolve. He was a human being, and he was suffering. Her punishment was to care for him, and by God she would do it not for Richter, but for herself. To let him die without lifting a finger would be to become the monster they thought her to be. Drawing on the rudimentary medical knowledge she'd gleaned from her mother, Abigail set to work. Tearing strips from her spare petticoat, she cleaned the wound on his side. It was deep and inflamed the flesh around it, hot to the touch. He groaned a low, guttural sound of pure agony, and his eyes fluttered open. They were dark, bottomless pools of pain and fevered confusion. For a terrifying second, they focused on her, and a flicker of hostile awareness crossed his face. His hand twitched, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Abigail froze, her heart leaping into her throat. I am helping you," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words were meaningless to him, but she hoped the tone would convey her intent. He stared at her for a long moment, his gaze intense, searching. Then the flicker of consciousness was gone, and his eyes glazed over, once more, lost to the fever. She worked tirelessly. She used her limited water to boil the cloth strips, to cool his brow, and to moisten his cracked lips. He couldn't eat, so the cornmeal and bacon were for her alone. She ate sparingly, her own survival, a distant concern compared to the immediate, all-consuming task before her. Days bled into a grueling routine. She tended his wound, which slowly began to lose its angry redness. She forced sips of water between his teeth. She sat through his fever dreams, listening to the torrent of Lakota words that poured from him, words of battle, of loss of a life she couldn't possibly imagine. Sometimes he would shout, his body arching in remembered pain. In those moments she would place a cool, damp cloth on his forehead and speak softly, not in words he could understand, but in the universal language of comfort. A strange intimacy grew in the silence of the shack. She learned the landscape of his face, the proud curve of his nose, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his jaw clenched even in sleep. He was no longer just a savage. He was a man stripped of his strength, his tribe, and his dignity, left to die at the hands of his enemies, just like her. Around the 5th day, the fever broke. She awoke one morning to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time. The fever was gone, but in its place was a sharp, intelligent awareness. He was weak, emaciated, but he was no longer delirious. She sat up, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The silence stretched thick with caution and uncertainty. He was the patient. She was the nurse. But he was also a warrior, and she was a white woman, the daughter of his enemies. Slowly he pushed himself up, leaning his back against the wall. The effort cost him dearly, and a sheen of sweat broke out on his brow. He looked at the clean bandage on his side, then back at her. He spoke a single word in his language, his voice a dry rasp. It was a question she could tell. She shook her head. "I don't understand." He gestured to himself, then tapped his chest. "Kangi." He said the name, a guttural whisper. It meant crow in his tongue. She understood. He was giving her his name. It was the first bridge across the chasm that separated them. "Abigail," she replied, pointing to herself. He repeated it, the syllables sounding strange and soft in his mouth. "Abigail." He then gestured around the squalid shack, a look of confusion on his face. He was asking where they were, why she was here. How could she explain? How could she describe the petty cruelty of Silas Richter, the sham trial, the bizarre punishment she could only point to herself, then to him, and then make a motion of tending to a wound? She hoped he would understand that she had been assigned to him. He watched her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, she saw not a patient, but a keen observer, a mind working behind the pain-filled eyes. He was assessing her, weighing her actions against everything he knew of her people. Later that day, she prepared a thin gruel from cornmeal and water. She offered it to him in a small tin cup. He hesitated, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. For his people, accepting food from an enemy could have a dozen different meanings, but weakness and hunger won out. He took the cup, his fingers brushing against hers. His hand was rough and calloused, but the touch was surprisingly gentle. He ate slowly, painfully. When he was done, he met her gaze and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was an acknowledgement, a truce. In the dying light of that day, they sat in silence, on opposite sides of the shack. The patient and the caregiver, the prisoner and the guard, the Lakota warrior and the preacher's daughter. They were two people from warring worlds, bound together by a sentence of death. but in the quiet understanding that passed between them, a fragile seed of something else had been planted. They were no longer just symbols of their people. They were Kangi and Abigail. And they were survivors. The week of provisions allotted by Silas Richter came and went. No one from Redemption Creek came to check on them. In their minds, the affair was concluded. The savage was dead, and the troublesome girl had either fled or succumbed to the elements. They were forgotten, erased from the town's daily life. This abandonment, meant to be the final nail in their coffins, became their salvation. With the immediate threat of the fever gone, Kangi's recovery was astonishing. The deep reserves of strength forged by a life on the plains began to resurface. Each day he was stronger, his movements more assured. He began to speak more, mixing the few English words he knew with Lakota and hand gestures. Communication was a clumsy dance of charades and guesswork, but they slowly began to piece together each other's stories. Abigail learned his full name was Kangi Leshka Spotted Crow. His band had been hunting on land their people had used for generations when Richter's men had ambushed them, not as a skirmish, but as a slaughter. He spoke of the attack with a cold, controlled fury that was more chilling than any outburst of rage. He was the sole survivor left for dead because Richter wanted to make an example of him. In turn, Abigail explained her crime. She tried to describe the concept of teaching children to read, of offering aid out of faith. Kangi listened intently, his dark eyes fixed on her face. The idea of being punished for an act of kindness seemed to be a profound puzzle to him. In his culture, generosity was a virtue, a mark of a strong heart. Richter's world, where compassion was a weakness to be exploited, was a foreign country with barbaric customs. One afternoon, as he was testing the strength in his legs by pacing the small confines of the shack, Cobb and another of Richter's men appeared on horseback in the distance. They weren't coming to the shack, but were riding the perimeter of Richter's claimed territory. Instinctively, Kangi grabbed Abigail and pulled her down out of sight. His hand was like iron on her arm, his body shielding hers. The sudden primal strength in him was a shock. He was no longer the helpless patient. He was a warrior, and his instincts were sharp as flint. They lay hidden in the dirt and shadows of the shack, listening to the sound of the horses' hooves grow nearer, then fade away. When they were gone, he released her, but the moment lingered in the air between them. It was the first time he had acted to protect her. "Richter." He grunted, his gaze fixed on the dust cloud of the departing riders. The name was a curse on his tongue. He now understood that the man who had destroyed his family was the same man who had condemned her. Their fates were not just entwined, they were forged in the crucible of the same man's hatred. This shared enemy became a powerful bond. They were no longer just two individuals surviving. They were allies in an unspoken war. Kangi began to teach her. He showed her how to find water by watching the flight of birds, how to identify edible roots she had previously overlooked. He taught her a few words in his language, Emni for water, Atefa Father Washte for good. She in turn taught him more English. She used her father's Bible, the only book she had, pointing to words and speaking them aloud. He was a quick study, his mind sharp and inquisitive. He was particularly fascinated by the stories of David and Goliath of Moses leading his people out of bondage. He saw parallels to the plight of his own people, driven and persecuted by a powerful, unyielding force. One evening, as a sliver of moon hung in the indigo sky, he was working a piece of wood with a sharp stone he'd found. His hands were deft and sure. "My people are scattered," he said, his English more fluid now. "Richter's men hunt them. They think I am dead. They have no leader." Abigail watched his hands, the focused intensity in his eyes. "What will you do?" she asked softly. He looked up from his work, his gaze meeting hers. "A leader does not let his people wander in the dark. I must find them. I must bring them together." The statement hung in the air, filled with the weight of destiny. She knew what it meant. He would be leaving. The thought sent a strange, unexpected pang of loss through her. This dilapidated shack, her prison, had become a sanctuary. The man who was supposed to be her punishment had become her protector, her teacher, her only companion. "When?" she asked. "Soon," he said. "The wolf does not heal in the hunter's trap." He looked at his mended side, then at her. "You have good medicine, a strong spirit." It was the highest praise she had ever received, worth more than all the polite compliments from the ladies of Redemption Creek. It was a statement of respect, earned not through birth or station, but through her actions in this dusty crucible. A few nights later she woke to the soft sound of movement. Kangi was standing by the door, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He was no longer the gaunt figure she had nursed back to health. He stood tall and straight, the power returned to his limbs. He was ready. He turned to her, and in the dim light she saw he had used charcoal from their fire to draw faint dark lines on his cheeks. He was reclaiming his identity, shedding the broken man he had been, and becoming Kangi Leshka once more. He had nothing to offer her, no supplies to leave. He had only his words. "You are not safe here," he said. "Richter will know you did not die. He will punish you again." "Where can I go?" she whispered, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. "I am an outcast." He stepped closer. He reached out, and with a gentleness that belied his strength, his fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. It was a gesture of such profound intimacy that it stole her breath. "Stay away from the town," he said. "I will come back, for the debt. For you." He did not say what the debt was, for his life, for her honor, for the injustices they had both suffered. He didn't have to. She understood. Before she could reply, he slipped out of the door and vanished into the darkness. He moved without a sound, becoming one with the shadows and the wind. Abigail stood alone in the shack, the silence now feeling vast and empty. The whispers on the wind were no longer mournful. They carried the promise of a warrior's return, and the stirrings of a rebellion she was now undeniably a part of. Kangi Leshka moved across the plains like a spirit. He traveled by night, using the stars as his guide, his senses alive to the land, in a way Abigail could only imagine. His body, now fully healed, was a perfectly honed instrument of survival. The rage he felt toward Silas Richter was not a hot, reckless fire, but a cold, hard stone in his gut. It gave him focus, not blindness. He found the first signs of his people, not in a camp, but in the subtle tracks of a few families on the move. A broken branch, a faintly scuffed patch of earth, the cold remnants of a small fire. They were hiding, scattered and fearful like quail in the brush. Richter's brutal tactics had worked. He had shattered their unity and instilled a deep, gnawing terror. The first family he found was led by an old warrior named Mato One-Eye, or Ghost Bear. His eyes, when he recognized Kangi, widened first in disbelief, then in reverence. The word had spread that Kangi Leshka had fallen. To see him alive was to see a ghost, a sign from Wakan Tanka, the Great Spirit. They said you walked the spirit road. The old man rasped his hand, gripping Kangi's arm as if to confirm he was real. "The road was not ready for me," Kangi replied. "Richter sent me there, but a white woman with a strong spirit pulled me back." The news of his survival and the strange tale of his rescuer spread like wildfire as Kangi moved from one hidden enclave to another. He found 12 families here, 24 there, all living in the shadow of Richter's empire. He spoke to them not of revenge, but of survival. He did not call for a rash, open war that would see them slaughtered. He spoke of a different kind of fight. The white man's strength is in his herds, his wagons, his iron rails. Kangi told them in the firelight of their secret councils. We cannot break his forts with arrows, but we can starve his cattle. We can burn his grass. We can make the land that he has stolen cry out in protest. We will be the ghosts he fears in the night. We will be the whispers on the wind. His words resonated with the young warriors who were tired of hiding. They were inspired by his story of survival and his clear strategic vision. The elders who had seen too much death were won over by his caution and wisdom. He was not just a warrior, he was a leader. Under the vast prairie sky, the scattered remnants of their people began to coalesce around him. A spark of rebellion had been lit. Meanwhile, back at the Lina shack, Abigail's life had become a solitary vigil. The loneliness was a physical weight, but Kangi's promise, I will come back for you, was her shield against despair. She followed his teachings, finding water and edible plants, husbanding her meager resources. Her solitude was shattered by the arrival of Sheriff Brody. He was a man worn down by compromise, his face a roadmap of moral concessions. He rode up to the shack, his expression a mixture of surprise and unease. Miss Hayes, he said, tipping his hat, unable to meet her eyes. The town thought you were dead, Abigail finished for him, her voice cool, as Mr. Richter intended. Brody shifted in his saddle. Richter wants to see you. He sent me to fetch you. The summons was not a request. Her return to Redemption Creek was as humiliating as her departure. She was brought before Richter, who sat on the porch of his large, imposing ranch house on the edge of town. So the little missionary survives, Richter said, his eyes cold and assessing. And the savage, he died. Abigail lied, her voice unwavering. The fever took him 3 days after I was left there. I buried him myself. Richter studied her, searching for any sign of deception. He had expected to find a broken, half-mad creature. Instead, he saw a woman who was thinner, her skin browned by the sun, but whose eyes held a new, unyielding strength. It infuriated him. And you've been living out there alone ever since, he sneered. A brave little thing, aren't you? I am resourceful, she replied simply. Her punishment had failed. She had not broken. Richter couldn't let such defiance stand. He couldn't send her back. The town might see it as weakness. So he devised a new torment. You'll work off your debt, he declared, to the community you betrayed. You'll work in the saloon, mending, cleaning, from sunup to sundown. It was a calculated cruelty. The saloon was the heart of Richter's power, a place of crude men and casual brutality. For the preacher's daughter, it was the ultimate degradation, a daily reminder of her fall from grace. Her father was devastated, but powerless to intervene. Abigail endured. She scrubbed floors sticky with spilled whiskey and tobacco spit. She mended torn shirts for men who looked at her with a mixture of pity and lust. She said little, her face a mask of quiet dignity. But she listened, and what she heard were whispers. Richter's men spoke of cattle disappearing in the night, of supply wagons found with their axles broken and their cargo gone, of prairie fires starting in the dead of night, turning Richter's best grazing land to black ash. They spoke of a ghost, a Lakota war chief who struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. They called him Spotted Crow. A fierce, secret pride bloomed in Abigail's chest. He was alive. He was fighting. He was keeping his unspoken promise to make the land cry out. Richter grew more and more enraged. His losses were mounting. His men were spooked, seeing enemies in every shadow. His absolute control was being challenged not by an army, but by a phantom. His paranoia grew, and his gaze fell on the one person connected to it all. One evening, as Abigail was sweeping, Richter cornered her, his bulk trapping her against a wall. His face was thunderous, his breath sour with whiskey. "Your savage didn't die, did he?" He hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You lied. You helped him." "I told you what happened," Abigail said, her heart pounding, but her gaze steady. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "He's out there, isn't he? Taunting me. And somehow you're involved. I will find out how. And when I do, the saloon will feel like a palace compared to what I'll do to you." He shoved her away and stormed out. Abigail leaned against the wall, trembling not from fear for herself, but from the terrifying certainty that the spark of rebellion she had helped ignite was about to erupt into a raging fire with her standing directly in its path. The name, Kangi became a legend, whispered on the wind, a source of terror for Richter's men, and a symbol of hope for the oppressed tribes. He did not lead a war party. He led a phantom army. They moved with the seasons, knowing the canyons and grasslands better than the lines on their own hands. They became wolves in the night, a shadow on the plains. Their tactics were brilliant in their simplicity and devastating in their effect. They never engaged in a pitched battle they couldn't win. Instead, they bled Silas Richter's empire slowly drop by drop. A dozen of his best horses would be spirited away from a remote corral. A herd of cattle being driven to the railhead would be stampeded in the middle of the night, scattering them for miles across the rough country, making the roundup a costly, time-consuming nightmare. They sabotaged his trapping lines, and on 2 separate occasions they dismantled several hundred yards of fence posts he'd erected on disputed land, leaving them stacked neatly as a gesture of contemptuous defiance. Kangi taught his warriors patience and discipline. This was not about mindless revenge. It was a war of attrition. He was fighting for the future, for the right of his people to exist on the land that was theirs. His second-in-command, a fierce young warrior named Chaitan Falcon, sometimes urged for more direct, bloody attacks. But Kangi held him back. "A wolf does not attack the bear head-on," Kangi would say, his voice calm around the council fire. "It harasses him, tires him, makes him waste his strength, chasing shadows until he is too weary to defend his kill. Richter is the bear. We are the shadow of the wolf." His reputation grew. Other scattered bands, hearing of his success, sought him out and joined his cause. His camp, hidden deep in a series of wooded ravines, swelled with families who saw in him their first real hope since the white man's tide had swept over them. He was not just a war chief. He was the leader of a burgeoning nation. In Redemption Creek, the pressure was suffocating Silas Richter. His investors in the east were sending angry letters about delays and losses. His men were becoming mutinous, tired of chasing ghosts and sleeping with one eye open. The empire he had built with brute force was being dismantled by an enemy he couldn't see, an enemy he had foolishly left for dead. His obsession with Abigail Hayes intensified. He was convinced she was the key. He couldn't prove she had helped Kangi, but the timing was too perfect. He saw her quiet defiance in the saloon not as dignity, but as the smug confidence of someone who knew a secret. He began a campaign of cruel, psychological warfare against her. He would have Cobb and his other men make veiled threats. They would talk loudly in her presence about what they did to Indian lovers. They would describe in graphic detail the fate of Lakota warriors they had killed. Sheriff Brody was ordered to watch her every move, to report on anyone she spoke to, anything she did. The entire town became her prison, and every citizen a potential spy. Her father, Reverend Hayes, was also targeted. Richter suddenly withdrew all his financial support from the church, a significant blow to its meager resources. He spread rumors that the preacher's daughter was mentally unstable, her mind broken by her time in the wilderness. The congregation dwindled, the pews growing emptier each Sunday, as people feared being associated with the Hayes family. Reverend Hayes begged Abigail to tell him what she knew. "My child, if you are in league with this man, you are inviting destruction upon us all. Renounce him. Tell Richter what he wants to know, and perhaps he will show mercy." "Mercy," Abigail retorted, her voice sharp with a pain he couldn't understand. "When has that man ever shown mercy? He left me to die, Father. He left him to die. The only destruction coming is the one Richter has earned for himself. I will not be his tool." Her time in the shack with Kangi had forged a new kind of faith in her, not in the meek turning of a cheek, but in the fierce righteousness of standing against tyranny. She was no longer just the preacher's daughter. She was an accomplice to the rebellion, a silent partner in the war for the plains. She drew strength from the rumors of Kangi's exploits, each story of his success, a vindication of her choice. The tension in Redemption Creek was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Richter, growing more desperate, decided on a new, brutal strategy. He learned from a captured native trapper the general location of the ravines where Kangi might be hiding. He couldn't launch a direct assault, as his men were too scared, and the exact camp location was unknown. So he decided to set a trap, using the most valuable bait he had. One evening, Sheriff Brody approached Abigail as she was leaving the saloon. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a deep shame. "Abigail," he stammered. "Yeah, Richter's gone too far this time. He's declared you a conspirator, an enemy of the town. He's offering a bounty for Spotted Crow's head, and he's letting it be known that he's holding you as leverage." She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She was a hostage. "He knows Spotted Crow will hear of it," Brody continued, his voice barely a whisper. "He's banking on the warrior coming for you. And when he does, Richter and 20 of his best men will be waiting." The trap was set. Richter had finally found a way to draw the wolf out of the shadows. He was using her life, her connection to Kangi, as the lure. Abigail looked past the sheriff, toward the dark, rolling plains that stretched to the horizon. She could almost feel Kangi out there, could almost hear the news of her plight being carried to him on the wind. He had promised to come back for her. And now that promise might be his death warrant. The news of Abigail's plight reached Kangi's camp faster than Richter could have hoped. A young boy from a nearby friendly tribe had overheard Richter's men boasting in town and had run for 2 days to bring the message. The council fire that night burned with a tense, angry energy. Chayton, his face a mask of fury, argued for an immediate, overwhelming assault on Redemption Creek. "We will ride into that town and burn it to the ground. We will free the white woman and send Richter's black soul to his creator." A chorus of agreement rose from the younger warriors, their blood hot for a decisive battle. But Kangi remained silent, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames, his mind a whirlwind of strategy and emotion. He saw the trap as clearly as if Richter had drawn him a map. A direct assault would be a massacre. It was exactly what Richter wanted, to lure his warriors out of the familiar protective terrain of the ravines and onto open ground where Richter's rifles would have the advantage. He also felt a profound personal ache. Abigail, the woman who had saved his life, who had shown him a kindness he had never expected from her people, was now a pawn because of him. The debt he owed her was not just for his life, but for the danger his existence now placed her in. His promise, "I will come back for you," was not just a vow, it was a sacred obligation. But he would not honor it by leading his people into slaughter. "We will not attack the town," Kangi said finally, his voice cutting through the angry murmurs. The warriors fell silent, their respect for him overriding their battle lust. To do so would be to walk into the hunter's snare. "We will not give Richter the battle he wants. We will give him the one he fears." He looked at Chaitan and 3 of his other most trusted warriors. "Choose the fastest horses. Paint yourselves for speed, not for war. We ride tonight, not to fight, but to make a claim." No one understood his plan, but they trusted his vision. 2 nights later, a chilling cry echoed through Redemption Creek, a sound that was not quite a wolf's howl, and not quite a human voice. It was the call of the Night Raider, a sound designed to freeze the blood. Men stumbled out of the saloon rifles, in hand their eyes nervously scanning the oppressive darkness that surrounded their small island of light. Then out of the night, 4 figures on horseback appeared at the edge of town, just beyond the light of the last lantern. They were specters, their painted skin and the powerful lines of their horses making them look like beings from another world. At their head was Kangi Leshka. He sat on his war pony, not with a rifle, but with a single eagle-feathered lance held upright. It was a symbol of parley, but also of authority. Richter, alerted by the commotion, stormed onto the street, flanked by Cobb and a dozen of his men, all heavily armed. "So the ghost decides to show himself." Richter boomed, a triumphant sneer on his face. He had him. The trap had worked. "Come to beg for your woman's life." Kangi did not answer him directly. His gaze swept over the frightened townspeople, peering from their windows over Richter's nervous gunmen, and finally rested on the church at the end of the street. Then he did something no one expected. He raised his lance and spoke, his voice powerful and clear, carrying across the dusty street in the Lakota tongue. It was a formal declaration, a speech of honor and intent. He was not speaking to Richter. He was speaking to the universe, to the spirits, and to the ancestors. When he was finished, he switched to the English Abigail had taught him. "Silas Richter, you fight like a coward. You use women as shields. You do not understand our ways. You think she is your prisoner. You are wrong." From the doorway of the church, Reverend Hayes appeared, pushing Abigail behind him. "Stay away from her, you devil!" he cried, his voice trembling. Kangi ignored the old man, his eyes locked with Abigail's. Across the charged space, she could feel the force of his will, the unshakable certainty in his gaze. "Abigail Hayes," he called out, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "When you saved my life, you created a debt. My life belongs to you. When my enemies used you as a weapon against me, they created a bond. Your safety is my honor. By the laws of my people, our spirits are now tied. I do not come to bargain for you as a prisoner. I come to claim you as my wife." A collective shockwave went through the crowd. Reverend Hayes looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Richter stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. This wasn't the scenario he had envisioned. This wasn't a desperate warrior coming to trade or surrender. This was an act of audacious sovereign power. Kangi was not playing by his rules. He was imposing his own. "You are insane!" Richter finally sputtered, raising his rifle. "She is a white Christian woman. She is a woman with a strong heart who was cast out by her own people." Kangi retorted, his eyes still on Abigail. "My people do not cast out the strong. We honor them." He looked directly at Abigail, his expression conveying everything that had passed between them in the quiet intimacy of the shack. The respect, the alliance, the unspoken affection. They have no place for you here. There is a place for you with me. With us. Choose Abigail. The choice was laid bare before the entire town. Behind her was the world that had condemned, shamed, and used her. The world of Silas Richter's cruelty and her father's frightened piety. Before her was the man she had saved, a leader of his people, offering her not rescue, but a position of honor in a world she barely knew. It was a choice between a civilized prison and a wild, uncertain freedom. Her father grabbed her arm. "Abigail, no, don't listen to him." She looked at her father's terrified face, then at Richter's hateful sneer. She had been living in fear for too long. Fear of judgment, fear of punishment, fear of being alone. But Kangi was not offering her a life without fear. He was offering her a life where she could be fearless. She pulled her arm from her father's grasp. Taking a deep breath, she stepped away from the church, away from the town, and began to walk across the dusty street toward the 4 Lakota warriors. Every step was a severance. Every footfall was a declaration. The townspeople watched in stunned silence. Richter screamed in rage, "Shoot her! Shoot them!" But his men hesitated. To shoot a woman walking willingly to fire on a man who had come under the sign of a parley lance, it was a line even they were reluctant to cross. Chaitan moved his horse forward, and with a movement born of pure grace, he reached down and swung Abigail up behind him. Kangi fixed Richter with one last smoldering look. "She is mine now," he said, his voice low and deadly. "And so is this land. You have your war." With another piercing cry, he wheeled his horse around. The 4 riders melted back into the darkness from which they came, taking with them the preacher's daughter, leaving behind a town in chaos, and a tyrant robbed of his prize and his victory. Silas Richter's humiliation curdled into a monstrous rage. He had been publicly defied and strategically outmaneuvered. Abigail's choice and Kangi's audacious claim had shattered his aura of absolute authority. He was no longer just a cattle baron fighting for land. He was a man consumed by a personal vendetta. "He wants a war, he'll get one," Richter roared back in the saloon, slamming his fist on the bar. "I want every man who can ride and shoot. We're going into those damned ravines, and we're not coming out until I have spotted Crow's head, and that traitorous witch is swinging from a rope. He offered double-pay whiskey and the promise of land. Greed and fear were powerful motivators. Within 2 days, he had assembled a posse of nearly 30 men, a mix of his regular hands, hired guns, and townsmen, too scared to refuse him. Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of grim resignation, was forced to ride with them. Richter was no longer waiting for Kangi to come to him. He was taking the fight to the heart of the wolf's den. In the Lakota camp, Abigail's arrival was a cause for both celebration and concern. She was treated with a cautious respect. She was the woman from the stories, the one who had saved their chief. A quiet, wise woman, named Tashina Wing, her shawl woman, was assigned to care for her, teaching her the basics of camp life, the rhythms of their day. Abigail watched Kangi as he prepared his people for the coming storm. He was a different man here. In the shack he had been a survivor. In the street of Redemption Creek, a defiant chief. Here among his people, he was a true leader. He moved with a calm authority, his voice never raised, yet his commands were instantly obeyed. He organized the evacuation of the elders' women and children to a more secure, hidden location, a deep canyon, known only to them. He came to Abigail as she sat with Tashina Wing, learning to scrape a hide. "Richter is coming," he said, his voice grave. "He brings many men with rifles." "What will you do?" she asked, her heart tight with fear for him, for these people who had accepted her. "The bear is angry. He crashes through the forest, making much noise, thinking his rage makes him strong," Kangi explained. "But it only makes him blind. He thinks he is hunting us, but he is walking into our trap. I chose the ground for this fight long ago. He had no intention of defending the main camp. Instead, he led his 40 warriors to a place they called the Stone Jaws. A narrow, winding canyon with high, rocky walls. It was a natural choke point, a place where a small, determined force could hold off a much larger one. When Richter's posse rode into the abandoned main camp, they found only the cooling embers of campfires. Their triumphant shouts echoed eerily in the empty ravine. Thinking the Lakota were on the run, Richter spurred them onward, deeper into the network of canyons. He was arrogant, blinded by his rage, pushing his men relentlessly. They rode straight into the Stone Jaws. The attack came not from the front, but from above and behind. Kangi's warriors, hidden in the rocks high on the canyon walls, unleashed a volley of arrows. The shafts rained down, sowing chaos and panic. Horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders. 2 of Richter's men fell in the first few seconds. Richter's posse was trapped. The narrow canyon made it impossible for them to form a proper battle line. The high walls offered their attackers perfect cover. Their rifles were useless against an enemy they couldn't see. "Get up the rocks!" Richter bellowed, firing his pistol wildly at the cliffsides. But Kangi had anticipated this. He had warriors waiting at the few accessible paths, ready to meet any man who tried to climb. The battle devolved into a brutal, terrifying skirmish. It was not the open field fight Richter had wanted, but a claustrophobic nightmare. While the main battle raged, Kangi had another plan in motion. He had seen the way Richter's men packed their ammunition mules, keeping them at the rear of the column. Chaitin and 2 other warriors had circled around through a hidden passage. They burst from a side canyon directly into the rear of Richter's posse. The attack was swift and devastating. They cut the ammunition mules loose, sending them stampeding back the way they had come, their precious cargo lost. Without fresh ammunition, Richter's men were doomed. Sheriff Brody, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, threw down his rifle. "It's a slaughter, we have to surrender," he yelled. Richter, his face contorted with hate, turned his pistol on the sheriff. "No one surrenders!" he screamed and shot Brody in the chest. The act of sheer barbarism broke what was left of his men's morale. They began to scramble to retreat, every man for himself. But Kangi was not looking for his men. He was looking for Richter. He saw the cattle baron trying to escape back down the canyon. Spurring his horse, Kangi charged after him. The 2 men met in a dusty clearing. It was not a battle of armies anymore. It was a reckoning between 2 men who represented 2 different worlds. Richter raised his pistol, but Kangi threw his lance with unerring accuracy. The heavy weapon struck Richter in the shoulder, knocking him from his horse. Kangi dismounted, pulling his knife. He stood over the wounded, sputtering tyrant. Richter looked up, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The man he had left for dead, the savage he had despised, was now the arbiter of his fate. "This land, it does not belong to you," Kangi said, his voice cold as river stone. "You do not own the dirt or the grass or the sky. You tried to break it. You tried to break its people, but the land endures, and so do we." He did not kill Richter. In a final act of justice, he took Richter's weapons, his horse, and left him wounded and alone miles from anywhere, stripping him of the power he held so dear, and leaving him to the mercy of the wilderness he had tried to tame. The coyotes would be his judge and jury. Kangi returned to his warriors, not as a conqueror, but as a leader who had secured his people's future. The threat of Silas Richter was broken. That evening, as the victory fires burned, Kangi came to Abigail. He took her hand, his touch gentle, and led her to a rise overlooking the camp. The sounds of celebration of a people free from fear drifted up to them. "You chose," he said softly. "You chose a hard path." "I chose a life with honor," she replied, looking at his strong profile in the firelight. "I chose you." He turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers. "In my world, a marriage is a promise, to protect, to provide, to walk the same path. My path is here with my people. It will not be easy." "My path is with you," Abigail said, her voice filled with a certainty she had never known before. He reached up and gently touched the scar on his side, the wound she had healed. Then his hand moved to her face, his thumb tracing her jawline. He leaned in and sealed their claim, not with words, but with a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, wild sage, and the promise of a new life forged in the heart of the untamed West. She was no longer Abigail Hayes, the preacher's daughter, the outcast. She was his, the bride of Kangi, a queen in a kingdom of canyons and stars. The story of Abigail and Kangi is a testament to the fact that even in the most brutal of landscapes, the human spirit can find not only survival, but a fierce and unexpected love. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the act of choosing a path of honor in spite of it. From a cruel punishment designed to break them both, they forged a bond that redefined their worlds and built a future from the ashes of injustice. Theirs was a legacy, written not in books, but on the vast open plains, a story of two worlds colliding to create a powerful, enduring love. If this story of courage, rebellion, and the untamed heart of the West moved you, please help us share it with others. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of history, drama, and the legends of the frontier. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the past. Thank you for listening.